Picture a phone buzzing at the exact same time every single day. Not an emergency. Not news. Just, "Hi, how's your day going? What did you eat? Did you sleep okay?" Kind, well-meaning, sent by someone who loves you completely. And still, somewhere around the third or fourth year of this exact pattern, a grown adult sitting at their own desk, in their own apartment, running their own life, feels something tighten in their chest when they see the name light up. And then, right behind that tightness, comes the guilt. Because how do you feel suffocated by someone who's only ever tried to love you? That specific, confusing combination. Real love, real suffocation, both at once, is what I want to spend this video actually explaining, because there's a specific psychological framework that names exactly what's happening here on both sides of that phone call, and it might be the most useful thing this channel has offered yet for the parents who feel hurt every time a call goes unanswered, and the adult children who feel guilty every time they let it. I want to return to a thinker we've mentioned before on this channel, because I think this specific situation, the daily check-in that starts to feel like too much, sits almost exactly at the center of his life's work. Murray Bowen, the psychiatrist who founded family systems theory, spent decades studying how families function as interconnected emotional units rather than collections of separate individuals. And the concept I want to build this entire episode around is one we touched briefly in an earlier video but didn't fully unpack, what Bowen called differentiation of self. Bowen pictured every family somewhere on a spectrum. At one end is fusion, a state where the emotional lives of family members are so tightly intertwined that one person's mood, one person's anxiety, one person's need for reassurance flows almost automatically into everyone else's internal state. In a highly fused family, it's difficult to tell where one person's feelings end and another's begin. At the other end of the spectrum is differentiation, the capacity to stay genuinely connected to your family while still maintaining a clear, stable sense of your own internal experience, separate from whatever anxiety or mood might currently be moving through the people around you. Here's the detail from Bowen's work that I think explains the daily phone call better than almost anything else. Differentiation isn't about distance. Bowen was explicit that a well-differentiated person isn't someone who's cut off, cold, or avoidant. It's someone who can be fully present and connected without needing that connection to happen on a fixed, anxiety-driven schedule in order to feel okay. The opposite of fusion, in Bowen's framework, isn't distance. It's a different, steadier quality of closeness. Connection chosen rather than connection required. I think this reframe matters enormously for the specific situation in this episode's title, because I don't think a daily check-in call is inherently a problem. Some families thrive on daily contact, genuinely, without any fusion dynamics underneath it at all. What Bowen's framework asks you to look at instead is the function the call is serving. Is it happening because both people genuinely enjoy the contact, chosen freely each day? Or is it happening because the parent's anxiety needs the call to happen in order to settle, and the adult child has learned, consciously or not, that not answering produces a level of parental distress significant enough that answering feels less like a choice and more like an obligation to manage someone else's emotional state? That distinction, chosen closeness versus anxiety managing closeness, is, I think, exactly what an adult child means when they say some version of, "I'm not a child anymore," even if they can't articulate the mechanism behind the feeling as clearly as Bowen does. They're not necessarily saying they want less love or less contact in general. They're often saying, underneath the frustration, that the current pattern of contact isn't functioning as connection anymore. It's functioning as a duty to regulate a parent's anxiety on a fixed, non-negotiable schedule. And that duty is starting to crowd out the parts of their own separate adult life that need room to exist on their own terms. I want to bring in a second framework here, because I think it explains something Bowen's theory describes but doesn't fully name. Why this specific tension shows up so intensely around exactly this developmental moment when a child has become a fully independent adult. Psychoanalyst Margaret Mahler, working primarily on early childhood development, described a process she called separation-individuation, the gradual psychological process, beginning in toddlerhood, through which a child moves from experiencing themselves as merged with their primary caregiver toward a stable, separate sense of self. A later psychoanalyst, Peter Blos, extended Mahler's framework into adolescence, describing what he called the second individuation process. A renewed, more sophisticated version of that same separation work, this time focused specifically on constructing an adult identity independent from the family of origin. I think what's useful about bringing Mahler and Blos into this conversation is the reminder that individuation isn't a single event that happens once, cleanly, at 18. It's closer to an ongoing process, one that can genuinely continue well into someone's 20s, 30s, even later, especially in families where the earlier, fusion-leaning pattern was strong enough that full differentiation simply didn't have room to complete on the usual timeline. An adult child pushing back against a daily call isn't necessarily rejecting the relationship. In Mahler and Blos's framework, they may be doing genuinely necessary, overdue psychological work, completing a separation process that, for whatever reason, hadn't fully finished yet, even though the calendar says they've been an adult for years. Now I want to turn this around, because I don't think this episode is useful if it only explains the adult-child side. Bowen's framework has just as much to say about why the parent's anxiety produces this pattern in the first place, and I think understanding that side honestly is just as important as understanding the frustration on the other end of the phone. Bowen's research suggests that fusion in a family system doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's very often passed down, generation to generation, through what he called the multi-generational transmission process. A parent who grew up in a more fused, anxious family system, without much modeling of differentiated, chosen rather than required closeness, often recreates a similar pattern with their own children, not out of any conscious intention, but because it's the only template for closeness they were ever given. A daily call that feels, to an adult child, like it's regulating a parent's anxiety is very often doing exactly that, quite literally. And the parent, if they're honest with themselves, might recognize that the anxiety driving that need for daily contact has real roots. Fear of losing connection, fear of becoming irrelevant now that the child no longer needs daily practical care, or an old, inherited belief that love which isn't constantly demonstrated risks disappearing altogether. I think this is where Bowen's work becomes genuinely compassionate rather than just diagnostic, because it doesn't ask either person to be the villain. The parent's need for daily contact isn't manipulation. In Bowen's framework, it's very often an inherited anxiety pattern doing exactly what anxiety patterns do, seeking the fastest available source of reassurance. And the adult child's need for more space isn't rejection. It's very often a genuinely healthy, if overdue, developmental process trying to complete itself. Both things can be true, and understanding that doesn't resolve the tension immediately, but it does change what the tension actually means. So let's get practical, because I think this is exactly the kind of episode that needs concrete tools, not just a diagnosis. If you're a parent recognizing yourself in the anxious, daily check-in side of this dynamic, Bowen's own clinical work suggests the actual task isn't forcing yourself to stop calling out of sheer willpower. That tends to produce a kind of white-knuckled restraint that often collapses the moment anxiety spikes again. The more durable work, in Bowen's framework, is building what he called a solid self. Sources of internal stability and identity that don't depend entirely on daily contact with your child. That might mean genuinely investing in your own friendships, interests, and sense of purpose, not as a consolation prize for reduced contact, but as the actual mechanism that makes reduced contact bearable in the first place, because your own emotional regulation stops depending so heavily on your child's daily availability. If you're an adult child recognizing yourself in the side that feels suffocated, Mahler and Blos's framework suggests something worth holding on to. Individuation doesn't require rejection to succeed. You can complete a second individuation process, build a clearly separate adult identity, and remain genuinely warm and connected to your parent on a rhythm that actually reflects your own choice rather than their anxiety schedule. The goal, in this framework, isn't distance for its own sake. It's connection that's chosen rather than required, which sometimes looks, from the outside, exactly like less frequent contact, but is really a difference in the internal quality of the contact, not necessarily its quantity. I want to offer something concrete for the actual conversation this tension usually produces, because I think naming a dynamic is only half the work. Bowen's approach to this kind of conversation emphasizes what he called I position statements, speaking from your own experience and your own need, without either accusing the other person or over-explaining yourself into a justification you don't actually owe. For an adult child, that might sound like, I love talking to you, and I want our calls to keep happening. I think it'll actually work better for both of us if we plan 2 calls a week instead of every day, so I have room to really be present for them. Notice what that sentence does. It doesn't reject the relationship. It doesn't blame the parent for wanting contact. It offers a specific, workable alternative pathway, the same kind of pathway thinking we discussed in relation to hope theory a few episodes ago. For a parent receiving that kind of request, Bowen's framework suggests the healthiest response isn't immediate compliance paired with silent hurt, and it isn't resistance either. It's genuine curiosity about your own anxiety underneath the disappointment. Asking yourself honestly what specifically feels threatened by fewer calls, and whether that fear is really about your child's love decreasing, or about an old, inherited pattern that equates frequency of contact with the relationship's actual security. Those are 2 very different fears, and only one of them is actually addressed by insisting on daily calls. I think what Bowen ultimately offers here is a genuinely hopeful reframe, even though it requires real work on both sides. A request for more space isn't evidence that love has diminished. It's very often evidence that a family system is trying to move from fusion toward differentiation. A healthier, steadier kind of closeness that doesn't depend on constant contact to feel real, but that can hold real depth, real warmth, and real presence within whatever rhythm both people actually choose, rather than whichever rhythm anxiety originally demanded. If this helped explain a tension you've either felt as a parent whose calls started going unanswered, or as an adult child who's felt guilty for needing more room, that's exactly the kind of dynamic this channel exists to untangle. Not to assign blame, but to give both sides language for what's actually happening underneath the daily habit that started to feel like something more complicated than it looks. If this helped, subscribe, because we're going to keep working through exactly this kind of everyday, easy to misread family tension. Next time, we're going to look at a related but different pattern. What it means when contact isn't frequent at all, but only ever seems to happen when someone needs something, and what Aristotle's oldest category of friendship has to say about that particular kind of hurt. That's next time, here on The Third Voice.